record. All right, we're recording. All right, so Angela and I are here talking about the Webview implementation for language servers, for the language server, as well as talking about the architecture between how someone would write web views and how web views communicate to our language server and to Webview plugins. So we're talking about Webview plugins currently, and the idea is that any web view, when you declare a plugin, you will have a setup function. And the setup function, you get two things back. You get a WebView message bus and an extension message bus. And the idea behind this is that when you're talking directly to a web view, you would use the WebView message bus. And that means I want to talk to an actual instance of a web view that's existing on someone's IDE. Whereas where I'm talking to the extension message bus, it means that I'm talking to the extension and a WebView instance doesn't need to exist yet. So this could be, scenarios for why we would choose one over the other would be the extension message bus is probably where most IDE has done some interaction. Someone's right-clicked and opened up a context menu and then it said something like, explain this code to me. Well, that's going to be an event that happens on the extension message bus. And then we'll listen to that event and need to do something, probably actually now calling things on the actual web views.
So can you go back to the graph?
Yes. Yeah, let me open that up. So yeah, so what would end up happening here is the plugin gets and I put everything in this little thing. This is my Excalidraw, not if I think if I do it from here to here, then it doesn't go away. Cool. All right, so plugins get to communicate through message buses. The message bus from the extension and from the extension actually communicates. Let's not do that.
Should we even back up and explain how, like, for people that are watching, how the communication between like just a normal, like if you had a web view and language server, how that communication would look like?
Yeah.
Should we do that?
Yeah, let's
like as a good grounding.
Yeah, so right now, well, yeah, let me open up Excalidraw again, because that's probably the easiest place to look. Is right now, when we look at the architecture for, like, say, Visual Studio or VS Code, which has chat, we have a chat web view, which this is, let's just say these are static. It's more than static resources. Instead, that it's the instance of the it's the actual web view panel. And
it's an embedded web view inside the Electron instance.
Yes, exactly. So let's say we have VS Code here, and I'm making it big because I don't know if I'm going to put anything inside of it. But anyways, we have this web view and we have VS Code, and it communicates over
the APIs, right?
Yeah, it has like a VS Code. I'll just call it the VS Code WebView API.
Things like post message and notifications.
Exactly. And so VS Code, what happens here is we have a little module inside of VS Code, which is essentially called, I'll just call it the WebView controller.
Yeah.
And this is we actually have a thing called like chat controller, and that is what's communicating with the WebView. I think it has like a WebView instance class underneath it that sort of extracts some of this VS Code WebView API stuff, but that's essentially the pattern here. And
now let's say you want to. No, I was gonna say, now let's say you want to talk to language server. Can you put language server on to the left?
Yeah, so let's say the language server, I'm going to put it down here as language server.
Okay.
So what happens now is if for something, let's say, this WebView controller needed something from the language server, it would need to call back out to the language server. We don't do this right now. Like right now, chat doesn't.
It doesn't. Yeah, it isn't. It doesn't talk to language server.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I sort of like, for me, I would consider an ideal would be when I open up a web view. For the most part, I don't need to. I shouldn't need to know what is my extension. I should say, hey, I'm running a web view. I've gotten all my data that I need to run from my host, whatever the host is. Either that's, VS Code, that's Visual Studio, that's JetBrains, or, what I think was even better would be, well, the language server is telling me what I need to run. And any events that happen to me are coming from the language server. So sort of like this is what we have today. I think a really high level overview of what we could achieve is I will create another chat web view, and I will create another, let's say this is the extension. So now we can say this doesn't have to be VS Code. This is just extension.
Yeah.
Extensions' whole responsibility is to all the extension needs to do with the chat web view is to embed it. Embed somewhere,
That's it. Just launch the app, basically.
Launch the app. Once this has been embedded, and it's not really a dual communication or anything like that. It's just this is an action that the extension does. So the chat web view exists, and the goal would be that as far as communication is concerned, it now just communicates directly with the language server, and the way I think even better would be you have these here's our web view implementation, or what I'm calling plugins, just because we could have multiple of them and it's nice to have a common interface between, how does a web view work? So I'm going to call it a web view plugin. And the ideal would be this can communicate just directly with this thing. And the WebView plugin could absolutely do something with the language server. I'm technically part of the language server. I have, already have context of what is my JSON RPC connection with my extension. So, but what ends up happening now is that the chat WebView communicates to the WebView plugin, and the WebView plugin can communicate to the language server it needs to. It can communicate to the extension.
Is it running in the same process?
It's running in the same process. Okay. We could do something different, but we definitely probably want to keep the same process in certain situations. We want a reference to the same JSON RPC connection and stuff like that.
So can the language server instance be running both IPC and WebSockets at the same time?
Yes, it can.
Okay, that's cool.
And in situations where we can't run WebSockets, we would do let's talk about, we have two types of transports that are going to be used right now. The first type is, so let's see, can I do just a big text up here? Let's call transport 1. Let's say this is WebSockets. That's the easy one.
Yep.
So what happens here is that, let me get rid of a few of these things. Extension still embed to chat view. Chat web view communicates with the WebView plugin. But the way it communicates is through a WebSocket, which essentially means that the language server has an HTTP server.
Yep.
Which then has a, WebSocket layer.
Yeah.
And if I took both of those.
And the reason why we want to do this because it's way more performant, right? If you're on desktop.
Yes, if you're on desktop, this is tremendously, you have a connection, and the connection doesn't close. You can just send messages back and forth. It's very, very performant. We're not having to check things like, you're not constantly checking, if you want to micro optimize, you're not checking headers and stuff like that for every request. And and we're also not flooding the, I don't think we've ever run into this issue, but flooding our standard in, standard out.
It could be a bottleneck.
If you were just
depending on
like,
how
hey, we're
much you're
constantly sending a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
So I think doing it this way ends up being, more performant. But the idea for WebSocket communication is that it's now like you have this sort of in between layer that's doing the work.
It's also simpler in some ways, because for debugging, for if something's happening on someone's machine, like just look at the language server, that's it.
Yes.
Versus, or
Absolutely.
you're only looking at two components, not the extension, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you don't even have to look at the extension to even run this. And that's one of the cool things about developing this thing too, is that the extension, outside of like situations where, let's say we were trying to
use some use some functionality, right? Like a VS Code API or something, right?
Okay. And there's nothing stopping the Webview plugin. So in every situation, the Webview plugin can always communicate with the extension.
Okay. So that's I think the missing piece that I had was like,
yes.
So the plugin itself is basically a package that like VS Code would import that would like, oh, I see. So all right. So for instance, as an example, like in a normal scenario, right? Can you go back to the regular scenario? Like the the original?
Yes.
Sorry, left.
This one.
Yeah. So
this is what we have today. Yes.
Yeah. Can you add the language server just to the left of this?
Yes.
Like just as if today. I'll use DaVinci as an example, because that's like the most recent one, right?
Yes.
So make a little bit of space and then do like some communication with the
language server communication
Electron instance. So VS Code is Electron instance. So how like I set this up for DaVinci, like going back and forth, because it made requests and it also received notifications.
Yes.
Right. But some of the things are VS Code API specific. So like, for instance, I wanted to have a feature where like if I press a button on the UI, it'll generate code in the editor, right? Which needs to send a VS Code API command to say, hey, run an inline suggestion request.
Yes.
So, and that's over RPC, and it goes through the Webview controller, or at first it goes through the language server client controller in the VS Code Electron instance, and then gets sent to the Webview controller, which gets sent to the chat Webview. So in the new flow, can you go back down with?
Yeah, go down to here. Yes.
So in the new flow, basically, if I'm in the UI and I want to run a VS Code API command, it'll say, hey, talk to the language server, which talks to this Webview plugin, which says, hey, run this VS Code command and let me know the response. That's how it's all done, right?
Yes,
okay,
exactly.
That makes sense.
And we get that kind of like full on JSON RPC communication with the Webview plugin when we're talking to the extension. So yes, absolutely. So it does mean there's a little bit of like, hey, I'm not, you could think, well, I'm missing out on something because my Webview can't just immediately just talk to the extension. It's got to go through this sort of cycle. It has to go up to the plugin. The plugin does, now let's communicate to the extension. But the important part about that is that, well, my Webview now no longer, I wouldn't have a implementation just for this one extension, like a VS Code.
Yeah.
Instead, I would say, hey, let's say I wanted to, so your scenario was, I want to initiate a code suggestion request. So chat Webview would say, hey, Webview plugin, we need to initiate code suggestion requests, whatever our message type would be.
Yeah.
Then this says, hey, I handle initiate Webview suggestion request, and I send a message down to extension.
And that message, so let's make that clear. The message would be like send notification. So the JSON RPC would be like, so Webview plugin would say send notification, right? Like it would use that API.
Yep.
And then the extension client still needs to handle, but the Webview plugin is it going to embed the VS Code API in it, or
no? So it shouldn't need to. What should happen is then the extension knows I listen to messages from the Webview plugin, and I can call stuff on myself.
Okay, so you would still need to implement on like the VS Code side, for instance, like, hey,
Yes.
run the suggestion if we get this message type, but that's really it. That's all you
Yes,
got to do.
that's it. Like, so you would only need to, you'd only be doing glue layer, you know, on the
Yeah.
extension. Um, and so there are scenarios where you don't, you know, there's scenarios where you don't save a bunch of like, you know, keystrokes or like writing code, you know, so you still have to go, hey, if there's anything the extension needs to do as a result of some
Yeah.
action taking place, you're still going to have that code living in the extension. Or we could do something where, um, the other scenario would be we have these standard actions that every extension will need to perform, and we use like the actual language server protocol to sort of describe the actions and you know what I mean, kind of like do this very data driven approach
Yeah.
to these actions. But I'm pretty sure there's going to be a lot of scenarios which really shouldn't be data driven. They're going to be very, you know, one off or very specific to what this one web view wants to do. Um, um, but yeah.
So where is the VS Code API? I guess so. For instance, the Webview plugin. So the Webview plugin is not really going to implement any VS Code APIs or anything. It's going to just
No.
be mostly it's going
So
to be
through
mostly JSON RPC, right? Talking to the
yes, so the
extension.
WebView plugin will have two ways of communicating: is one JSON RPC and the other one is a WebSocket. So you technically in this situation you have um, um, technically you have two transports that you're running that are based on who you're communicating with. Um, um, but really, why I call this the WebSocket transport is because when you're talking to the web view, you're always going through WebSockets in this one scenario. Now with VS Code, the easiest one to do is to do transport number 2, which is pure just JSON RPC. And the
Okay.
reason for this is now what ends up happening is you would have code sitting in. So let's actually say this is VS Code.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
let's say it embeds just like normal. We don't have an HTTP server. We don't have WebSockets. We still have the WebView plugin. Instead of chat WebView directly communicating with the WebView plugin, it now communicates with
Like a package.
yes, a small package that would be called something like, and maybe this is VS Code specific. So this is just essentially the VS Code WebView communication package.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sure. You know, let's just say that. The VS Code WebView communication service. And
So
essentially what ends up
the
happening is
so
now
wait,
this, yes.
sorry, so the language server plugin should be a separate package in the language server that has the VS Code client API, for instance, right? That would be imported as a package, just like the GitLab LSP in the VS Code extension.
It
Is
could. So
that
what you're saying is that this is a separate package that's living in the repo for the language server. Is that what you're saying?
yeah? Because I'm assuming you'd
Yep.
want to,
Yeah.
share types
Absolutely.
and all the
Yeah,
fancy
yeah,
stuff.
yeah. But the goal behind the VS Code WebView communication service is just that it opens up a JSON RPC channel to communicate with the language server and then send stuff to the web view. And so
Yeah,
now
that makes sense.
this is the I don't need this anymore, but this is all just JSON RPC. So you'd
Okay.
still have this thing happening if I want to communicate with the web view directly. So instead of going down this path, instead of doing this side of the equation, it's this. And then I can still do this, where I can still run the web plugin directly to the extension. And so really it's just a proxy. So the VS Code is proxying all messages from the web view to the WebView plugin through a specific channel that we're just going to say, hey, this is when you want to communicate to a WebView, you communicate through a channel called, something. I think right now, I think in my POC, it was called GitLab Webview instance message. You know.
So question for that then. What about like the maintainability aspect? Like, what is harder? Like, is this all going to be? So I guess that goes back to the original thing. Can you go all the way to the left?
Yeah, all the way.
Original.
This one.
So these buses, I'm sorry, the message bus. So
back
like,
down here.
so most of that can be abstracted away with these
Yes.
message buses.
Yes, and that's the whole goal, is that the plugin never has to think about either one of these type of scenarios. The
So
plugin
as
just
long
goes,
as, sorry, so as long as the
Yeah.
plugin has the correct, like, it's just like a serializable JSON message, basically.
yes,
Okay.
exactly. So what ends up happening is the transports get back, you know, so let's say in this scenario, they're getting there's a WebSocket transport, and the WebSocket transport is saying, hey, great, we've got a message, and we send this to the, you know, Webview message bus. And the extension message bus, it communicates with, let's just say this is the language server. So you're all within the language server at this point. So I'm just going to call this the JSON RPC connection. So this is the actual connection with, that is communicating with this. Oh my gosh. Let's go.
I don't know why it does that.
I don't know why it does that either. But yes, that
Okay.
will, and so the idea behind that is in plugins themselves never have to think about, and then anytime we get events, they are, so the plugin, when it calls for the buses, it can say, hey, probably the best way to think about it is that the buses can get back message handlers from this message handler cache. So anytime they've registered, hey, I want to listen to this message type. So the plugin has said, I want to listen to this message type from the WebView message bus. It gets, that message handler gets applied to a cache. And then anytime the transport says, hey, I've got a new message, it will check the cache and say, hey, do we have a handler? And then call that handler if we do. So that's how the plugin gets its sort of round trip of, I want to listen for messages, but I also want to publish messages.
Yeah, so that's my next question. So
Yep.
So is this a promise based, like, request response? Like, what's like a practical, like, can you show like some maybe you can show
some sample code. Yeah. So let's
but not like the abstracted code, because I think that would be hard to follow. Like maybe your
let's go with,
POC.
yeah, that's probably, yeah, the POC is probably a good one to go with. Yeah, let me actually open up the POC, because I don't think that's what I had here.
But if it's too much work to open the POC, don't worry. I know how outdated.
Yeah, and I don't think it's in a great demoable state right now, because I was tearing it apart for things. And I'd have to reset. I don't want to reset without knowing what I'm changing here.
Yeah, no, that's
yeah,
no
but I can do this. Let's I think a good spot might be, let's replicate that feature that you were talking about, which is I have a web view, I'm listening to something, and then I need to send a command to the extension as a result of some event that's taking place.
Yeah.
So let's actually,
that's honestly the most complicated one.
Yes, that's how I feel as well. So, and that should totally be possible. So let's go. So I had this WebView chat package, and it's a very, you know, it's really just trying to demonstrate that you'd probably, in the same package within the language server, probably bundle both your plugin and your, like, hey, this is the app side of my WebView. This is the thing that needs to be bundled into some JS. But of course, I broke things because I changed the name of stuff. This would be now called GitLab WebView plugin. Cool. And that fixed everything. All right. So the idea behind this is, when you create a plugin, you supply it an ID, you supply it a title, and then you supply a setup function. The most important piece of the setup function, the ID is important in that you don't want to do, we definitely need to, if we have web views with the same identifier, we have problems because we don't know which one to send messages to. So
Yeah, no, that makes sense. No, that makes sense.
so and we don't have a way of deterministically like creating we'll create a random GUID or something like that to apply to it. So that's important. But anyways, the setup function. Let's actually say we have a couple of messages that we want to do. So let's say we want to this was like or what was the thing that we wanted to do was from the web view we want to say there's an event that needs to trigger a
Just you press a button, it says generate. That's what the button says.
okay,
And it needs to tell the VS Code extension somehow run the inline suggestion request. It's literally like VS Code dot command dot run inline, and then it's like custom command or whatever, and inline dot suggestion request. I think it's something like that.
does it have any data associated with it, or is it just no data? It's just
imagine it can. Imagine you want to send some others something with it.
Cool. So we'll have an on press generate as a type of message that could come by. And then let's say there's another, let's just create another type of message where for this one we want to say extension, and there's going to be a command essentially, extension request code suggestion.
Okay.
Command. And there's probably better naming conventions here. So it's more the idea than the execution here.
Yeah, don't worry about that. Yeah.
So let's say this is called extension request. Okay, let's just say this whole thing.
Yeah.
Like that. And
how'd you do that? How'd you do that? You converted it from like.
I just copy pasted and then I went back here and I pressed E.
Oh, you did that so fast. I thought you like pressed a command. I was like, that was crazy. Never mind.
When I know what I want to type, I can type fast. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So what we end up then doing is when you create a plugin, it takes generic, which is your strongly typed messages. And right now it's a message map where you can define web views and you can define what are my client to server messages. But then I can also define extension and I can say what are my client to server or server to client. And we know that like our extension request code suggestion command is going to say this is a server to client. Server is always the language server. Client is either the extension or the web view in this nomenclature. So we would say, hey, our server to client messages would be like the extension request code suggestion command is one type of message. You can chain these messages with an and we could and so like on press generate would be a client server.
Yes. Yeah.
Sweet. And of course these can be, hey, these could feel like they're getting gnarly or unwieldy and you could abstract them out and stuff like that. So
yeah, I guess you can just you can use like type what is it called, where you like you can define two interfaces and then make it conditional on a key, and whether that key is populated, you can have something like that. Like
yes, absolutely,
that's not an issue. Yeah.
No. And then so now that I have these chat messages, I can actually say I can go ahead and go, all right, now when we know webview dot on. And then it can only be of the type either new user prompt or on press generate based on what I've sent. So if I do on press generate, I now go, there's going to be an instance ID, which is the WebView instance ID. And the idea behind this is that technically we could support, and we want to think about being able to support the concept that you've opened multiple views. And so for each instance ID, we would say, what is my it's just going to be this. And the reason it's this is because we know there's no data. If I said something like this, data, it's going to freak out at me. And the reason is I've said that it does not contain a payload.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I see.
This kind of helps allow for someone to go like, all right, I put data in and then I sort of expect that it's an any type and I can do weird things with it. And I just, keeping stuff like that. Anyway, so WebView on press generate, we get an instance ID. I can now say, hey, let's say extension dot send, and I can send extension request code suggestion command.
extension dot send extension. Okay.
So whenever the
And
web view
then,
sent
so
me
your
this,
extension, sorry, your extension plugin is going to receive that
yes,
message, and then that's when it'll run a VS Code API.
exactly, yes.
Okay. And that is done in a package on the left here, or
So if I
in,
going, you mean a package on the left, meaning over here?
or I mean, sorry, go back to the code.
Yep.
And the package to the left, like those packages, is that something you implement as a package, or is that something
Yes,
you
yes. So
implement?
each like WebView chat would be it's a package that's only going to be run on the language server. So you'd still each extension would need to say, is this something that I would manage? And so each extension is going to have some concept of, hey, I can get messages from the from the language server through this channel, and then I can say, hey, I need to expressly handle extension request code suggestion command as a message. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And
So,
so
but is this
yeah.
just for JSON RPC, or is this for WebSockets?
So when you're communicating an extension, you're always communicating over JSON RPC.
Okay.
And that's just because that's just the whatever the communication channel working between the language server and um, um, the language server and whatever its extension is, which is, since we're using language server protocol, it's always going to be JSON RPC. Um, and so that would end up communicating over something like this. It's sending a notification to GitLab. And we could say the way I've got it set up right now, and I think this makes the most sense because the way the JSON RPC protocol works, or the way this is working for the language server, is you have to pre-set up all of your all your
Handlers.
listeners, like your channels ahead of time. And
Yep.
so we can't just go like, hey, we're as a new plugin comes available, let's go ahead and register all these things. So the communication channel for this is something like GitLab, Webview, and this wouldn't end up being instance message. This would just be Webview message. And then what every extension is going to need is something that says, hey, I listen on this, and this is a standard message that includes something like, well, what's my WebView ID? What is my my message is going to be some sort of object type, and then what is my message type? Some sort of string. For us, that would end up being, hey, we've got extension suggestion command, WebView ID would be chat, and then you'd have a message payload, which could be anything. For VS Code, we could get the benefits of saying, hey, we know these types. We're in TypeScript. We can import the types of what chat messages are, and then drill down to what are my extension server to client chat messages, and get some strongly typed, what these messages could be. But when we're in something like NeoVim or Visual Studio or JetBrains, we wouldn't be able to get that. So we're still in sort of untyped boundary land, and we'd have to know, hey, you call me with this message type, I expect my, let's call this payload. I expect my payload to be of a particular structure. But this is just JSON at this point.
Okay. So that makes sense. And then so basically it's all event based. It's not like request response.
Yes, it's all event based. Now there's technically the
Hmm.
expectation is that these can be, asynchronous, because the expectation is you're probably going to need to do something like, hey, we need to fetch something from we need to fetch something from I don't know, API
Anything
gateway
async.
or whatnot.
Yeah.
And the same thing for like sending. Right now, I think my send is expected to be a void, but I really just need to make them all promises. So that's something that probably needs to happen just in general. Is that, hey, if you're going to write to something, based on the transports implementation, it's better for us to err on the side of, hey, everything's going to be a promise here, rather than everything's not. I do think that for extension, I'm pretty sure what's going to end up happening. So you get this extension message bus. I think that I need to see if I can possibly do this. Maybe I can. We might have to have two different. Let me go back to Webview plugin, source, message bus extension. What I'd like to see is then we also have a send, and then we might have something like a request. And that's actually a promise, whereas like send is like a notification. Maybe we should call this notification. Or
Yeah, I think that would help.
Yep.
And that's what I'm thinking, like to backtrack, like maybe it would be nice that while like you get the MRs in for these message buses,
Yep.
in tandem, like just build a sample app, like call it example app, and I
Yeah.
don't know if you've already been doing that, but that might help where it just goes through each one of these paths. So like as a developer, I can just like, because for me it's hard, like the code in and out, right? Because you wrote the abstractions. But for me,
Right.
it's like hard to connect. Okay, so I'm writing a new app. I want to do the exact same scenario that I'm talking about. Like what's an existing path that I can do that shows that?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that would be super helpful. I mean, it could be like a follow-up MR, of course, and that might even be more ideal, right? After you get in the abstraction stuff.
Yep.
Because it might need to
Yep.
change depending on that. But I think like having a sample app showing all of this would be super helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's going to be lots of patterns that start to emerge too. And that's important to see things like here is a good example of, I'm listening for an event that the WebView is publishing, but then I'm communicating with the extension, you know.
Yeah.
And then I think there's going to definitely be, examples of, so for instance, the extension, even if I were to say something like I don't have any client to server commands that are, or client to server messages that are here, but the extension has a default set that are already always going to be available, and these are like your lifecycle methods or lifecycle events for a web view. So we might very easily do something like, hey, a WebView instance has been created, and I know that my callback is going to end up being, hey, oh, I got a WebView ID and a WebView instance ID. Well, what I want to probably do here might be, well, I need to push, the current state to the instance. So, especially if you're doing something like chat, where we kind of have the scenario of anytime a new chat instance is created, we want to make sure that we push the current set of chat messages to that window.
Yeah, that's another thing I was gonna say is like some things are request response based, some of them are event based. Like a chat would be more event based,
Yeah.
but some things like the button generation thing, you'd want to know that that button generation was successful. So do you have to create, like maybe it'd be nice to have also, I don't know, that's even more abstraction, but like just like you had like a request event,
So
so it
I think
handles
that,
that state,
yeah,
like internally it handles it. I don't know.
I think that one thing that you could absolutely do is do something like WebView on press generate. Let's say we had an extension where I'm expecting that we probably end up having a request. Let's, for right now, key T, let's say it's server to client. But most likely this would have to be a whole different set of things, because you're going to say something like, oh, here's my payload. It's a promise. Right now, let's say it's void. But we know that Most likely
Yeah,
you're
you
using
could
like
just
a
add a
request.
second generic argument.
You'd have a second generic argument. What is my actual return value? Okay, so let's say we did that, where instead of this, let's say it's a request. Um, um, let's do an await. I think the way that you would probably do this is then to say webview.send, and then you would send something like, hey, extension request code suggestion command, or like essentially like extension, something that lets you know that, hey, this is done. And up until that point, up until you've received that, you know, let's just say on
Yeah,
first
that's, I
generate
think that
complete.
would really, that would help reduce complexity. But again, I don't know. Like,
And then I think that's pretty much what you would do is essentially go, hey, WebView on press generate, do a bunch of work, then send, hey, we're done with this, because we know that we're going to show something like a loader or something, you know.
yeah.
So I think that would probably end up being the pattern for working with web views. I think that when you're working with the extension, it does make sense that you could use requests. Does the VS Code API does it do requests? I
What do you
I think
mean?
it so like I'm gonna call it like the
No.
request structure. I mean, I'm actually gonna
So you mean the WebView API, right?
the
Or
VS Code WebView API. Will
yeah,
it?
so it's so the messages is like on notification, I think,
Yes.
and on and then post message.
Yes.
So
So it's
it is
pub sub.
entirely, it's entirely pub sub.
Okay. Which is
Yeah.
what we've got. That's what we have here, is very pub sub.
Mhm.
And I
I don't
think
know what
that,
it looks like for JetBrains though, and all those
yeah, and I know that Visual
add-ons.
Studio is pub sub as well. So like I knew that I couldn't do
Yeah, yeah.
requests
It's
from the
probably
lang
the
from
same. Yeah.
yeah. So I think that when you're dealing with web views, you'd always have to do this kind of pattern of, if I want to show a loader based on something, I'm waiting for something, then I would need to either, do work and then send, hey, we've completed this work now. Um, um, it's a little less like requesty and a little more like, it's very event driven. You have to do that whole like
Yeah.
the state
But
management.
the whole point of this is also handling the WebSocket like
Yes.
communication, right?
Yes. So you're
Um,
not like having to think about, well, how this is communicating at all. Yeah, and the goal around that is, so like for instance, I'll show you a transport that I have here, and then maybe I can open up the other one. So this is the JSON RPC connection transport. It's really, really simple. I get a JSON RPC connection, which is that VS Code language server connection.
yep.
And then I just implement this transport interface, which I listen for certain things on the connection. So like if I'm listening for like WebView method opened or WebView method closed. Really, this should be WebView method, probably WebView instance created, WebView instance destroyed, and then WebView instance message. So this is just all general messages run through this one channel, and then this is how you can publish messages through that channel as well. It can send notifications through that channel. Here's the structure of the
Is
page.
on notification synchronous? Or sorry, is send notification synchronous?
That's a really so send notification. No, it's a promise. So this should definitely be. I
Yeah.
mean, really, all of these need to be promises, and so
Okay.
um, this should be a promise. This should be async. This should be like.
But again, yeah, like
Yeah,
it's all
absolutely.
like,
I mean, really, every one of these, yeah, should have
I
anything
mean,
we're pushing should be asynchronous.
I mean,
All
what
yeah.
I'm saying is we'll like figure all this stuff out like as
Yep.
you make a sample app and you try to
Yep.
get everything working with the sample app. So it's
Yep.
like,
Absolutely.
and I think that's like I think we should just make that known in the um make that known in the I'm blanking here. Make that known in the MRs like, hey, this is
Yep.
just getting the boilerplate code in, and then
Yep.
like it's like under like like separate folders not really being used anywhere, but then eventually like when you'll tie it all together and
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you've got time, do you have time? I don't want to take too much of your time.
No. Go
Okay,
ahead.
cool. Awesome. Yeah. So the MR that's there today, and yes, I absolutely need to probably just make these all asynchronous. So anything that has like anything that's a message bus that's going to push or publish messages, those should all be async. But what's there in the MR today is just this lib WebView plugin, and the whole thing that we're doing there is getting everything needed for this setup function, so that
Yeah.
plugins can be, plugins can be used. Now, one thing that I think is important to note, and I talked with Thomas about this, was I fully expect that this will not be everything that a plugin will need. Meaning that for like chat, I know that we're going to need like what's the current authentication information, because we're going to need to make requests to the GitLab monolith or to. So because of that, I have every expectation that you will have plugin factories where someone said create chat plugin. Where it's going to take in, auth info or whatever it needs, and then returns this stuff. Where now the setup function can just use whatever, it's created a closure around it and can now use whatever's been passed into it. Those will then be the responsibility of anytime the plugin needs to be, registered over here inside of the actual, then inside the actual language server, then it would then we would pass in whatever is needed from the language server into the plugin. Yeah, that was the only caveat there. But yeah, so this is all the types necessary to get this so where you could make plugins. And then I'm gonna have, and it's not giant, really, the whole goal is to be able to get plugins, and then it has some of the real, the types needed to get stuff up and running. And then it has the message buses, and they're just the types that are going to be conformed to when we build those. I will have an MR probably open, if not today, then really early tomorrow. That includes so like this lib WebView transport, that's actually just a single set of types for different transport implementations to implement. So I'll then have another package for transport JSON RPC, and then have one for transport WebSocket. And then if we had other transports that we could think of down in the future, that could definitely be, that could be a thing. Meaning something like if there was ever a situation where we were doing something where the language server didn't live on the same process or didn't live on the same machine, there was actually like a TCP connection to something, then maybe that would need a different kind of transport, but then the core package is definitely this lib WebView communication, and that's where the implementation for my message bus doesn't like whatever was happening here. I don't know what. As soon as I changed I'm missing requests. Yeah,
we're running the TypeScript compiler for each of these packages too, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
So we run the TypeScript compiler, but we don't emit any JavaScript. The goal right now, there might be packages where we do want to emit JavaScript, but right now for a lot of these packages, the expectation is they're all consumed locally within the confines of the language server. So when I look at like my TS config, we say it's a composite and it doesn't emit anything. And then if I go to like my TS config here, I include it as a reference so that we do all our type checking and everything, and we make sure that all of our references are expected. But I went to like my package JSON, its main is the index.ts instead of like a compiled directory. The only reason I think we would need to do the compile directory is if we were going to say, hey, we're going to publish this, one of these packages as,
Yeah.
um, um, and yeah,
No, this
so
looks good. So
yeah, so let me jump real quick to, let me go to plugin real quick. I'm going to go to message bus extension and I'm going to remove this just so that we're not, it doesn't look like everything's broken. Yay, everything fixed.
cool.
So in the biggest thing here is that like setting up the WebView communications actually fairly simple. The idea is that you pass in what's the current JSON RPC connection, what are my current transports, and then what are my plugins, and then it just does all the wiring up for you. This would essentially be called by the main in node would say something like, let me see if I can actually from at GitLab. I'd have to let's include it. So and then I'll include it as a dev dependency because the expectation is it gets put into the bundle, and we don't want if someone does an npm install, it'll fail if it's a workspace package.
Yeah.
So we do GitLab.
This is scary though. We should make sure we have some ESLint rule or something that's you're not importing client code or VS Code into the language server bundle.
Right. Yes,
I've gotten
absolutely.
bitten by
Absolutely.
that so many times.
Yes.
But
Yes. And that's something that we should, we hopefully
I had a mono repo where we worked in Next.js and
yeah.
Nest.js in the same mono repo.
Weird.
And
Yeah.
we've had like a production bug where someone was importing like a client API into the server,
Okay.
just because it was like a shared package that they were using,
Right.
and
Yeah.
just like
Yeah.
weren't thinking about it. Yeah, it's mono repos can get kind of wild like that. I
They
don't know
can
if
get,
there's a link,
yeah, they can
but
get wonky. Yeah, so the way this would be used by the language server would end up being something like workspace.
yeah, that makes sense.
Um, and
And then honestly, what you could do is probably find an ESLint plugin to check if that package is designated as a. You can even write a custom ESLint rule, honestly,
yeah,
that like checks if that package is client or not, and
yes.
then
And I think that so like for instance, my my bundler, so this was done in a previous MR, was so like if I go to my ES build, maybe it's in common. Yeah, I do this node externals plugin, where so all of my node packages aren't included in the bundle because the expectation is that you're going to do an npm install. Um, but the workspace packages are included in the bundle because they're not going to be npm installed. So that allows for when we do like a bundle of source node and we get it out node main bundle, it will include anything that got like imported within that node tree from my my various packages.
cool.
Yeah, so really, when we do like set up WebView communication here, so this is where like this is where I was kind of saying really early on, I was saying there's two sides to the whole WebView thing. Is one, we need to serve web views, and the other one is we actually not serve our web views, but we need to serve web views, and then we need to actually like set up
Register,
set up the WebView
notifications,
communication. Like what do we do once those web views are and when we serve web views, that's the whole process of. And we would only, so like when we're in VS Code or like the the web IDE, really the language server doesn't serve web views. It just says, hey, we have a static path that you can get the web views from the out directory, from the package, which is kind of how they're done today. We just say, hey, this is the path on your machine where the all these WebView files are located. So I think that in VS Code, that really wouldn't change. It would just point to the NPM package, node modules, GitLab LSP, web views, because that's how they're like in the out directory. That's where I'm putting web views right now. Like WebView, when you build chat, it creates this assets in the index file.
Cool.
And so that would be included in the NPM package. And then, but in things like Visual Studio or JetBrains, where, hey, when we want to serve web views, it'd be really nice to do it over, HTTP, where you could just point to a local host, and everything just works the same way you would be developing your web view anyways. Then in this like serve web view section, that's where we would need to like create HTTP server, create WebView,
WebSockets.
yeah, WebSocket, yeah, do all that stuff, and then and we still do this kind of like based on plugins. Like we would look at that plugin, the plugin information, cons plugin. Did I get plugins from here? No, I don't. I'd have to import from GitLab. It's not gonna let me do it. WebView plugin. Oh, maybe I can. Yeah. And then we should plugin, WebView plugin. So let's say we had a whole list of plugins. We would probably say, hey, when we're creating our WebSockets, or our HTTP server, we're going to look at those plugins, and based on the ID, we expect, hey, this is where those assets are going to be located and stuff like that. And then for when we say set up WebView communication, that's when we would say, hey, we're just going to call setup WebView communication, where we've passed in the connection, we've passed in plugins, it's needing transports, which right now, let's say nothing, but probably we would just do import from GitLab. What did I call it? Packages. It shouldn't be transport. It should be WebView transport JSON RPC. Let's do it in NPI. Let me go back to here and say GitLab WebView transport JSON RPC. And run main. Yeah, or WebView transport JSON RPC, JSON RPC connection transport, and this is probably
That makes sense. Yeah.
That's it. Well, maybe does this require anything else? Oh, it's required to be an array. Yep, that makes sense. Yeah. So right now, this is all I would need to do to be able to set up the WebView communication over this transport. Right now, this wouldn't support WebSockets, but because I would need to use the WebSocket transport, which I haven't built yet. I have it in the POC, but I don't have it here. And I would use my sort of WebSocket server that I've created over here to build that transport.
I feel like doing JSON RPC is initially is the best move.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think that this gives us everything we would need to do like VS Code. And I don't know if so when you talk. Oh wait, we're recording. Aha.
But we can finish up anyways because
yeah. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording here. But
cool.
Yeah, I think this is. Let me actually figure out where I can stop recording. Let's first stop the screen share. Okay. All right, I'm stopping the recording now.
Cool. Sweet.